Okay, so this contribution this afternoon is called The Masque of the Pandemic. And I'm just going to make sure that, Joanna, you can see the next picture, which is a picture of a moomin wearing a mask.
Yes, I can.
Yes,
Yeah.
great. So I live in Finland, and what I can say about Finland is that mask use has only just really started because the government only just recommended it a few weeks ago. But I fully expect that within a couple of months, the whole adult population will be wearing Moomin branded face masks. And even the Moomins have started wearing Moomin branded face masks, which probably tells us quite a lot about fashion dynamics. And just jump in, Joanna or Poppy, if you can't hear me, but I think things seem to be going okay so far. So, who am I? Well, that's a picture of me wearing a mask that you can just dimly see there. I am not a sartorial fashion scholar, and I'm not going to pretend to be one this afternoon, but I am actually married to one, and a lot of our conversations in the household center around fashion studies. So, a lot of what you often talk about probably goes into my head through osmosis at home. But I am interested in the sociology of fashions in general, particularly as fashions are located in long-term historical change. And ultimately, what I try to do is to look at contemporary social and cultural events and contextualize them within not just hundreds of years, but thousands of years. Um, and in terms of masks, what I can contribute to the discussion about masks today and fashion and masks more specifically is that I'm very interested in, and I've done research on the history, sociology, and anthropology of masks around the world, long term over hundreds and thousands of years. I'm a sociologist. If people at a party ask me what sociology is, I say it's two things. It's basically using a lot of big words that end in ization and ification. And I'm going to use some ization words in this presentation. I'm going to look at three things today. The first is some things that we've all observed over the last 6 months since the pandemic arrived. And then I'm going to move on to look at some background ideas for further thinking about what we've all observed. And then finally, I'm going to finish off by arguing that the last 6 months looks like an unprecedented appearance of masks in human life, but it's actually a reappearance. And I think that's what's interesting about it, that the mask has come back. It has not just appeared. So let's think about stuff we probably all observed over the last 6 months. Well, the mask has become the pandemic's major cultural icon. It's become as iconic for this situation as the condom became for the AIDS pandemic, if that's what it was, in the 1980s. The mask has become iconic. And as COVID-19 has spread around the world, so too has there been a concomitant spread of masks as well. But just as COVID is uneven in its spread, so too has been the spread of masks. And of course, just as COVID comes from East Asia and spreads to the rest of the world, so too does widespread masking as well. As we all know, public masking has been widespread in East Asia since at least the SARS epidemic of 2002, 2003. But if you look at this in a longer term historical perspective, you'll see that mask wearing has been a common public feature of life in Japan for at least 100 years since the influenza outbreak of 1918, 1919, when the Japanese really started mask en masse for the first time. And masks have stayed in Japan and other parts of East Asia for over 100 years because of further flu epidemics, because of natural disasters like earthquakes, and then from the 1960s onwards due to increasing pollution. So, in effect, what you have is the situation where there's been a massification of masks in East Asia for a long time, and then a movement out from East Asia to the rest of the world of mass masking, such that you could call this a kind of Asianification of the world. And as the mask has spread around the world, it theoretically involves all and any people, from the oldest to the youngest, from the highest to the lowest, at least theoretically speaking. And I say that theoretically because, of course, some people can afford masks more than others. And in certain locations like India, where in many places masking is mandatory, a lot of people cannot afford to buy masks. And therefore, they're put into new forms of inequality because simply they have to choose between feeding themselves or being able to purchase a mask in order, hopefully, to reduce COVID. And of course, as we might expect in a complex late modern society, it's been unclear as to what works and what doesn't work in terms of which mask to wear, how to mask, and so on. And although there's an increasing scientific consensus about what works and what doesn't work, I think that if you were to do surveys amongst publics around the world as to what they thought masks achieve, there would be huge confusion and huge anxiety, because there's multiple information sources about what masks to wear and what masks can achieve, different forms of contradictory guidance. So just as not a week goes by without us reading in newspapers that drinking red wine is good for you, and then the next week drinking red wine is bad for you, so too there are all these contradictory sources about what masks can achieve, and increasing public skepticism towards science and scientific authority means that there's just complete confusion over what the purpose of mask wearing actually is. Turning to the fashion element, of course, a face mask exhibits relative homogeneity of form, which means that they're not that different in terms of the form of the mask. They have to do certain things, covering the mouth and nose. But within that relative similarity of the mask's form, there's apparently endless substantive stylistic variety. There's just no end to what kind of mask one can wear or one can design. The world of the mask is endless in terms of stylistics. And if you look around the world as masking has spread to almost everywhere, you see an interesting combination of globality and regionality. On the one hand, masks everywhere around the world are generally the same, and yet masks are different around the world as well, depending on what region you're in. So here, hopefully you can see in the slide some masks from higher class Indian people at the top left, some more lower class Iranians, bottom left. At the bottom right, variety of masks that people adopted in the early phase of the pandemic around about February. And also the situation in Israel, where people of different religious persuasions, men who have beards, of course, as Poppy was just saying, masks have had to be designed in order to protect them as well. So you've got globality, masks are all the same, and regionality, masks are very different depending on where and at whom you look. The mask is, of course, a device for social distancing. Basically, it says, in some senses, keep away. But then on the other hand, the further dialectic is that the mask is also a way around social distancing, because it's clearly the case that many, many people think that by wearing a mask, somehow magically they're protecting themselves and others, even when they're sitting next to others and could potentially be infecting them. So the mask is both social distancing device and a way of dodging social distancing. But above all, I think that the mask is a testament to human creativity, because what we've seen over the last 6 months is an explosion of masking. Go onto the internet, go onto Google Images, and you'll find literally hundreds of thousands of newly generated graphics like that there, which indicate people have been designing more and more mask-based iconography to disseminate around the corners of the internet. And if you look at the vast proliferation of mask memes that you find on the internet as well, then you find more and more stuff like this, raising a laugh or not, as the case may be. So people are being creative in all sorts of ways in terms of representing masks, but they've also been creative in terms of selling masks, that over very short periods of time, fabrics have been brought into the world of making your own mask. And so whole micro industries are either shifting or being created in order to supply the vastly increased demand to create masks. And it's also the case that on the internet and on the streets, you find people selling masks in all sorts of ways. And there's been a huge amount of creativity in terms of commercializing masks. Here we have a picture from a Thai subway station where it's a vending machine where you can buy masks. And the creativity is all about DIY making masks in all sorts of possible ways. And creativity has also extended to professional making. Here we have a picture of the atelier of the Paris Opera House that was shifted into mask production in March and April. And so professionals and non-professionals and amateurs are all making masks over the last 6 months. It is an explosion of making. And we have different forms of inventing, not just different designs, but different weird and wonderful forms of creating the very form of the mask itself and playing around with its materiality. And as Poppy mentioned just a moment ago as well, the creativity has extended into dealing with the challenges of the mask faced, such as developing this kind of mask that allows lip reading. And there's no end to the amount of designing that can go on. It's just endless possibilities for what you can do, endless play, endless possible ways of representing what you want to represent, and probably in ways that might be more open to creativity than the t-shirt. And more creativity in terms of styling, such that here we have the Slovak president, Zuzana Kapotova, who quite early on in the pandemic made a big splash with her matching of masks with her broader outfit. But also, of course, matching is not the only art of the mask. Another developing art form is contrasting your mask with your broader outfit. And we've had some occasions of less successful styling too in the political realm, such as that. And artists have moved into making masks, such like the German Namibian artist Max Siedentopf, located in London, who's produced a whole series of semi-parody masks. Here's how to survive the deadly global virus by putting half an orange on your nose and mouth, or putting a Tesco bag over your head, and so on, making a serious point through humor. And now we come to probably the crux of the matter for today, the fashionization of masks. And it seems to me that a large part of the fashionization is making the intolerable tolerable. Of course, it's partly about cashing in on the need or the craze for masks, but also it seems to me that when masks become part of fashion systems, it's about neutralizing the difficult situation of the pandemic. It's about normalizing that situation by saying we're still able to be fashionable even under these conditions. Crucially, I think that the fashionization of the mask is about saying this is not just a war effort. That we're not just making identikit masks that can be used in hospitals or PPE for care homes. By turning the mask into a fashionable object, it's basically saying, okay, we may be at war, but we're not only at war because we're trying to recreate peacetime conditions. And so ultimately, the fashionization of masking could be said to be, at least in part, about making the abnormal normal. And plural fashion systems have taken up the mask. On the left there, a masking practice in Africa, South Africa. And on the right there, an American design label creating what it presents as African fashions, turning into creating African masks. And of course, as we know, and as I'll talk about in a moment, that of course men, generally speaking, across the world seem to be more reluctant to wear masks. And so the styling of male masks is regendering, because it's saying masking is for men as well, and it makes you fashionable or beautiful, it makes you the dandy and so on. It's a regendering of the male reluctance to wear a mask. And here, just launched very, very recently, our Burberry's August 2020 masks, retailing at about €90 a go, and other major fashion houses and high-end production companies have their own mask lines now, such as Givenchy. And the luxury goods market has moved into masking. So here we have 24 karat gold plated mask offered in a particular region of Turkey to Turkish brides at socially distanced weddings. That particular model there currently is retailing for about 10,000 US dollars, which rather suggests the blingification of the mask. But the fashionized mask is not completely new. That is from Paris Fashion Week, spring, summer 2015, where the Chinese designer Masha Ma presented a series of anti-pollution masks because, of course, already mass masking and looking good during mass masking has been a big thing in East Asia for quite some time. And just before the pandemic hit in December and January, just passed, well, Australia seems to be on fire and people have to wear protective masks, but already fashion designers in Australia were producing masks as part of fashion collections just before COVID hit. So, masks everywhere. And we might well expect a backlash to that, such as the anti-masking movement that you see in many countries, but especially perhaps the US. And the backlash to the rapid appearance and rapid spread of masks, of course, has become politicized, where you don't wear a mask if you're some kind of a Republican, but you certainly do wear a mask if you're a Democrat, and so on. And it seems to me that the anti-masking movement bears some understanding in relation to the dialectics of fashion and anti-fashion, that the dialectic of masking and anti-masking needs to be compared to the dialectic of fashion and anti-fashion, and the anti-masking dialectic also needs to be understood in relation to how it interacts with the dialectic of fashion and anti-fashion. To make a mask fashionable is basically to embrace the mask and to send out an implicit or explicit message that you're for masking and that you celebrate the mask and that you are against this kind of person who wants to get rid of masks altogether. And all of this is not wholly new because, again, if we go back in time to the pandemic of flu in 1918 and 1919, there was already an anti-masking movement in the United States then. The flu pandemic of 1918 and 19, during that, the US government regarded men as the weak link in terms of infection control, because then, as now, men tended to see wearing a mask as emasculating, as somehow feminizing them. And there was a very big US government campaign that drew on patriarchal notions to persuade men to mask. And this campaign said that to wear a mask is to be a patriot, because if you wear a mask, then you are protecting the weak, you're protecting women and children. And this patriarchal pro-masking campaign worked very successfully from all accounts. But still, there was a major anti-masking movement in America at the time, and some instances of violence between anti-maskers, all male, and the health authorities. So we've been here before with anti-masking and gender dynamics. And so the current mask non-observance in terms of men wanting to perform a certain kind of masculinity against a perceived femininity, this has appeared before almost exactly 100 years ago. And in that sense, it's not surprising to see it back again. Right, that's part one done. We're now going to have a change of direction. All of those things I'm sure you know about. You've observed them as you've browsed the internet, read newspapers, and so on. But now what I want to do is do something rather different. I'm now going to argue that the recent appearance of the mask apparently everywhere is actually a return of the mask. Let's put all of this into very long-term context. Looking at the anthropological record of masks and masking over long periods of time and worldwide. The mask that's pictured there is from Mexico, for example. There are four key dimensions of mask and masking. masks and masking, I think, if you look at human history. Cultural symbolism, identity hiding and identity projection, both at the individual and the group level, practical accomplishments, and appraisal by others. So, very quickly, masks have cultural symbolism. In a society, there are widely shared ideas of the meanings of masks. That connects with identity. Masks are, of course, in part about hiding a person's identity, but they're also about projecting an identity too. And that is at the level of the individual self and of projecting the identity of a group. So hiding and showing, individual and group. Masks are about all of these and make them possible. Masks also have certain practical affordances and accomplishments. They allow you to do things under certain conditions. And finally, if you're wearing a mask, it will always or almost always be appraised by others. Others will be making of your mask something. They'll be understanding the semiotics of it. They'll be understanding you as the masked person in certain ways. And they will be evaluating your activities as a masked human being. And masking throughout human history has always been about gender. It's always been about politics. It's always been about religion. It's always been about aesthetics, and so on and so on. And in any given society, it's also often been about the subversion of a particular society's gendered order, political order, religious order, aesthetic order, and so on. Humans have used masks for millennia. Magic, ritual, and ceremony have all been made possible by masks. When a shaman puts on a mask, when a medicine man or some kind of person wanting to achieve something magical or mystical puts on a mask, think of it like being like a spaceman's helmet. For they're in a dangerous position and they need to accomplish certain things. So just as the spaceman is protected by from a potentially hazardous environment, so too the shaman's mask is like the spaceman's helmet. You put it on to protect yourself while doing dangerous work. And masks are at the root of drama, as we know from the masks of ancient Greek comedy and tragedy. Indeed, I think it's very important to note that masks are at the heart of personhood and identity. For example, back in ancient Rome, the actor's mask was called the persona, and all subsequent Western discussions of things to do with persona and personality are ultimately rooted in the idea that the actor's mask projects their identity to an audience. Deep psychological and social psychological stuff. That is masking. Around the world and across time, there's been a huge diversity of mask types. Full face ones, or those that only partially cover the face. Those that are on top of the head only, so you wear them on your hair, they don't cover the face. Made of soft material, made of hard material, made of mixtures of soft and hard, and made with various accessories, such as, for example, feathers. Secret societies are, of course, made possible by masking, and how they terrorize other groups on an ethnic or a gender or a sexuality basis is all made possible by the masking. Hence, the Ku Klux Klan could not be what it is without its masking practices. And also, there's a diversity of covering practices as well when you look around the world at how people have masked. Western masks often cover the eyes, but that's not the case everywhere. If you look around the world, it's not just about the eyes being covered by the mask. Mouth or ears or other parts of the face can be more important than the eye covering. It's the West that focuses on eyes. And one of the reasons why Western masks are so eye-focused is because since the ancient Greeks, Western culture has had an assumption that eyes are windows to the soul. But Christianity, in its early period, like in authors like the early church father Tertullian, were very much focused on the face and the eyes because they said the face is God's gift. So don't paint it, don't put on makeup, and don't cover it up, and don't cover your eyes because this is God's gift and it is a terrible sin to cover the face. And suspicions of masks creating sociocultural disorder have been around for a long time, since at least the early days of Christianity. The classic case here being early modern carnival in places like Rome and Venice and Germany, where it's thought that once the population start to wear masks, they'll get up to no good and engage in all sorts of terrible behaviors, especially sexual licentiousness. But masks symbolize law and order as well as disorder. Just think about the Caped Crusader, the Lone Ranger, or Zorro. They're all figures to do with law and disorder, and they all operate semiotically because of masks. Masks symbolize who is upholding or breaking, or who is above or below and beyond the law, as with the masked executioner. Blindfolded justice indicates justice and fairness, just as the masked highwayman indicates social disorder. Masks have been very important for a very long time, but one feature of modernization in the West meant that masks disappeared from much of everyday life. Masks became, as modernity developed, more sequestered into particular professional domains. You didn't see masks except in places like hospitals or in nuclear power plants or in popular dramatic representations of these. And masks became somewhat trivialized. They become something that you get in a horror film that gives you a mild shock, but a mask is no longer something deeply sacred as it was, for example, in ancient Greece. And the mask becomes a bit of a joke. And the mask becomes something that you see at Halloween as part of children's party games or as adults playing. The mask both loses its seriousness, but also it becomes, as modernity goes on, becomes associated with sinister or dangerous or uncomfortable or repulsive activities. Hence the uneasiness felt about masks. But in recent times, masks have become partly serious again, as the Guy Fawkes mask, derived from the comic novel and from the film V for Vendetta, show being widely taken up in the Occupy movement and other anti-capitalist demonstrations. It's both deeply serious and playful at the same time. The mask had disappeared from modernity, at least in certain Western countries, but then has come back again. So Muslim face veils and face masks, I think, is an important topic to start to end on, because this is really a big, important part of the politics of the face. Muslim face veils and face masks come together as a friction-laden conjunction of two face regimes, or two facial regimes. On the one hand, the Western facial regime is that the face must be visible for reasons of civic virtue. If you're hiding your face, you're a bad person. You're not a citizen. You're not playing the game. And therefore, don't wear a mask in everyday life. But on the other hand, in the Muslim face regime, you certainly, as a female, should cover the head and maybe cover the face to some extent as well for reasons of modesty. And therefore, you should use a veil that may or may not cover parts of the face. So these are two different face regimes. And now, Western governments that have been so keen to get Muslim women not to cover their faces now want the face covered by masks. This goes against hundreds of years of cultural assumptions that in public places you don't cover your face with a mask, otherwise you're somehow dodgy and unreliable. Now, Western governments that were apparently so anti-face covering want face covering. And so old arguments about veil face coverings being bad start to fall apart, logically speaking, because now that so many people are wearing masks, we see quite clearly that Muslim face veils do not necessarily hinder communication between people. And we also see that Muslim face veils do not necessarily betoken antisocial dispositions, because now to wear a mask and to hide your face is to be social, pro-social, not antisocial. And it is the case that I've found some accounts by Muslim face veil wearers that their lives have become a little more easy since mask wearing became mandatory or advised by Western governments, because more and more people have their faces covered and these women stand out from the crowd less. But as we speak, new arguments are being created that want to say masks are good and veils are still bad, that somehow the veil as a face covering is a bad thing, that a mask is nothing like a veil. I think that this is where anti-Muslim rhetoric is now headed, to make a strong distinction between the two kinds of face covering, because it's been logically revealed that they're not actually so dissimilar.
David,
The,
I'm
yeah,
sorry to interrupt, but that's 30 minutes.
it's perfect because I'm on, I think, my last substantive slide. I'm nearly done.
Good.
There's no end to this because masking is going to go on indefinitely, just as the pandemic and the social situations of the pandemic go on indefinitely. I hope you can see this because I tried to put it all in one slide. To sum up, the mask has become ubiquitous, practically and culturally, for only about 6 months in most countries, but not in East Asia. This looks like a major novel appearance, an unprecedented eruption of masks into social life. But considered historically, what's happened in the last 6 months is actually a reappearance and a return of the mask. Where masks were present in the past, they were often then made absent, but now they're made very present again. Where masks were marginalized, they have become socially central and culturally central too. And where masks were trivialized, they have been made serious as well, also in a dialectic, as flippant. And where masks were depoliticized, just the silly mask of the horror film, they have now become highly political, or highly political again. All of this needs to be understood in deep historical and cross-cultural terms. There's already a wealth of studies to draw on by anthropologists and sociologists and others, and we need to use them now if we're interested in studying the significance of masks and masking. And then, if we draw on all those studies, we can see that what is repeating the past and what is really new. Because some stuff has happened before, albeit in somewhat different ways. But in order to understand what's really new about all these masks and all this masking, we need to know what happened before. And we do that by consulting the anthropological record. So if you're interested, I've written some stuff recently on this that's open access. And it's all available from that web address, which is my research portal. So it's all sitting there as open access stuff if you're interested. And I'd love to hear from anybody who's writing about masks because perhaps we could share some ideas. And finally, now it's over to you.